Welcome to Rock and Roll Book Club, where we discuss books by and about musicians and the music business. I'm Shelley, and on this episode, me and my co-hosts Dave and Jen are digging into Face the Music by Kiss frontman Paul Stanley. If you haven't read the book, this is your one and only spoiler alert.
Let me give a little context on Paul Stanley for those that don't know. I can't believe people don't know, but for those few that don't, Paul Stanley is one of the co-founders of the band Kiss. Kiss started in 1973. Paul was 21 years old. Kiss went on to become one of the most famous bands in the history of music. There was a time when Dick Clark infamously said that there's only two bands in the world that everybody knows all of the members' names, and that was the Beatles and Kiss, because everybody knew all of them. They were such a part of pop culture in the 1970s. They were beyond just a band. Kiss has sold over 100 million albums throughout the world, dozens of gold and platinum albums. They've had major success throughout the time. There is not a person on the planet, I don't think, that when you show those images, the star, the demon, the spaceman, whatever, will just go Kiss. There's really three major segments to this book. There's Paul Stanley's life growing up in New York as a kid, teenager, etc. Then there's the career part where he forms Kiss and becomes the biggest rock star in the entire world, although we realize he's actually one of the most famous people on the planet and one of the loneliest, saddest people in the world at that time. And then there's the post 90s kind of enlightened Paul Stanley. So before we get going, let's talk about what our thoughts were on the artist before reading the book. Let's start with Jen. What were your thoughts on Paul Stanley prior to reading the book?
Oh, this book. I love him. I'm amazed.
No, I love him.
I know.
Jen and I are in a fight over who gets to have Paul Stanley in their life.
Exactly.
We're both crushing so hard.
I will say my boyfriend, Paul Stanley, has got so much depth. I mean, this guy's incredible. And you said post 90s where he was enlightened. I know you are diehard Kiss fan, but I kind of think he was always enlightened, but I understand.
He probably was. Yeah. It just wasn't public.
Yeah. No. Yeah. Yes.
Right.
But I think there was so much more to him than I expected. I hate to say that. I didn't know much about him. And I mean, I knew Kiss and I grew up with it with my younger brother, but at the same time, I'm astonished by what an amazing guy he is. And he's a great writer.
Yeah.
Those are my initial thoughts. I will let Shelley talk about my boyfriend, Paul Stanley.
Okay, Shelley, you can talk about Jen's boyfriend, Paul Stanley, real briefly.
Well, I prefer to talk about my boyfriend, Paul Stanley. Okay, but before I read this book, I would say I had zero thoughts on the individual Paul Stanley, but I can tell you what I thought about Kiss.
Okay.
So when I was 4, Kiss was my favorite band. I also wanted to paint my room black, so I just feel like I had a little bit of inner rock and roll as a child, even. And so for multiple Halloweens in a row, I was Kiss for Halloween, and I'm going to show you a picture here.
Nice.
Right on.
Okay, so this, if you can see it.
Oh yeah, I can see the Peter Criss makeup.
That was me for Halloween. Notice my moon boots covered in foil. And now I also want you to note the t-shirt and the jeans, because I have another story related to those. And related to Kiss. When I was a little girl, people in the Midwest might remember Richmond Gordman.
Oh yeah.
And for those who don't, it's sort of like a Sears, JCPenney kind of department store. But they would offer portraits. You could get your portrait taken there. So my mom said, we're going to get your portrait taken. And she wanted me to wear a dress and put a barrette in my hair and look super cute and girly. And I completely shut that down. And I was like, no, I will not be wearing that hideous outfit, which probably was an adorable dress she had made for me, frankly, which sorry, mom, for that. But I insisted on wearing my jeans and my Kiss t-shirt. I was like, that's what I want to be photographed in. That's me. And so, you know, as much as you can argue with a 4-year-old, that happened. And then finally we compromised and I wore a barrette in my hair and my jeans and my Kiss t-shirt. Dave, when I was listening to your awesome playlist that you sent us, that I'm sure you'll be
linked below. Paul Stanley top 25, linked below.
It's so good. So good. I was just nerding out over that list. As I was listening to it, though, I was like, there's so many songs that I remember from being a kid. So clearly I was rocking out to Kiss at some point.
Here's my Kiss Paul Stanley shirt. That's from 1987. That's from the Crazy Nights tour. Anyways, I've been a Kiss fan for as long as I can remember. I too did like them before I knew anything about their music. Like as a very little kid in the 70s, I used to have pictures of them posted on my wall and I couldn't even tell you what a song was, you know? When I got to be about 12 or 13, that's when I started really listening to it. And that's when I became obsessed. And anyone will tell you, Jen will tell you, like back in high school and stuff, that was part of my reputation was I was known as this Kiss dude. Because I wrote about Kiss in the student newspaper and I got to meet them when I was 14 or whatever. And, you know, all these other little things. So I was definitely known there. Part of the reason why I identified so strongly with Kiss was because those two guys were Jewish. Because although there were plenty of Jewish celebrities, rock stars, but they never made that anyway part of their identity. They didn't talk about it. They never mentioned it. And David Lee Roth did a little bit, but Gene and Paul were, while that wasn't part of their Kissness or whatever, they never shied away from talking about it. And, you know, the Holocaust touched both of their families and stuff, and they were open about that kind of stuff. So they were someone that you could look up to a certain degree. Now, when I look back, they used to do a lot of dumb and embarrassing shit in interviews that are just cringeworthy. But at the same time, when I was 13 and looking for some older role model or somebody cool or famous or whatever that was Jewish, you couldn't find that many. I mean, every Jewish person in TV was like some sort of variation of Woody Allen, just this nerdy, just nebbishy, just like whatever. And like, I couldn't stand that shit. I didn't identify with that in any way. That wasn't what I was like. And that wasn't what any of the Jewish people I knew were like either. So the fact that they were so famous and so that was a big part of it. So Paul Stanley has been a huge part of my life. I have plenty of issues with stuff that Paul has done over the years, but it's mostly from a Kiss fan perspective, not necessarily like, you know, I don't disagree with his politics. I don't disagree with any of the stuff that he espouses, you know, like his sort of a lot of his feelings on a lot of topics. I don't disagree with any of that. We really should start off with the early days, with Paul's youth, and the major factor, and this was the biggest reveal in the entire book, because I can tell you as a lifelong Kiss fan, this was never written about, never discussed, never hinted at, never mentioned, was Paul Stanley's deformity of his right ear, that he basically doesn't have one. That he has that microtia, I think is what it was called. And he was born with just kind of like a stub for a right ear, and he was deaf on that side. And I can tell you that was never known by anybody. I mean, there's gossip about Paul Stanley. There was, oh, maybe he's gay, or maybe he's transgender, or maybe he's this or that. Okay, they had all sorts of stupid rumors about him. There was never a rumor about him with that ear, because I had never, ever heard that. That was the biggest reveal of the entire book, and it colors everything.
Huh.
Never knew that. Never knew that. And he reveals that right at the beginning, you know, in that first anecdote about the Phantom of the Opera thing and how he was approached by those people with the children with deformities or whatever. But that was the first time it had ever been mentioned.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, and it's such a big part of who he is, you know, and if it was never talked about, for so long, it was probably very freeing for him to get that out. I have a lot of thoughts on his early life. I mean, I'm gonna think about what Shelley's boyfriend Paul went through. Fine. Growing up.
Well, I'm the unmarried one, so I feel like it's fair.
It's all you. It's all you. You got it. But I just like get to say hi and get a picture with him. So that's
You got it.
maybe have a talk. Okay, so first of all, he had a severely mentally ill sister beyond, and I mean to grow up with that, it almost sounds like it was no fault of hers. She was mentally ill, and to grow up with that instability with parents that are tough as nails and provide no love and they left them. How old were they? 5 and 8 when they would go out every night?
Yeah. Well, and also
the parents would go out.
Psychological care in the 1950s was either nothing or you go to an institution. And those institutions were hellholes back then.
Yes.
I mean, they were the stuff of nightmares. So I can't put myself in the position of their parents, but I could definitely see where putting your child in an institution, which is a very scary place, versus just kind of pretending like they don't really have a problem or whatever, is probably your best bet is going to be to pretend that the kid doesn't have a problem, just using the social norms of the time. Not that that's the preferred method.
But see what the parents did. They went out all the time. So they most likely, I mean, whatever they had going on, but I mean, I just think they just probably downright didn't want to be around her. And, they left Stanley alone with her.
Yeah.
And
on top of that, so they're alone and they're hiding hammers and knives under their pillows because they were afraid that they were going to be attacked by, a robber. But also they're leaving Stanley at the time, which is Paul Stanley's real first name.
Right. Stanley
They're
Eisen.
leaving him alone with his mentally ill sister who, later was violent and he was terrified of her. So it's like, yeah, I get that they could keep the sister around because there really weren't great options, but like you didn't have to leave them alone and you didn't have to leave your youngest alone with his sister who he's terrified of. So it's like a double whammy.
Yeah, I'm not endorsing their parental strategy or whatever. It was bad.
It was really bad.
Yeah,
it was
and it obviously did a number on Paul, and you wonder, okay, well, so he's growing up with the mentally ill sister, with the kind of detached parents, but then he also has this deformity. And as everybody knows who's grown up, because we all were kids at one point, kids can be incredibly cruel. And stuff that happens to you when you're in your formative years, like your kindergarten, first grade, second grade, that shit stays with you for the rest of your life. Mm-hmm. It definitely does. So that seems to be, I mean, I don't want to just brush aside his sister or his parents' kind of sort of benign neglect or whatever. It was to a certain degree. But just that alone of having that deformity and the way that kids are still cruel now, but imagine how much worse they were in the 1950s, when he was a little kid.
Stanley, the one-eared monster.
Right. I mean, that's incredibly mean. And there's just no way to escape it. And it definitely colors the perception of Paul that I've had all of these years, just because of the fact that I just never knew that about him, and that he was hiding this thing in the 70s, and that was the major part of his problems with everything relating to other people and relating to women and relating to his parents and relating to success and relating to whatever. It all went back to that childhood stuff of when he was picked on because he was, such a target of so much hatred as a kid.
Also, there's the fact that like he got spit on when he was 5, I believe. Was he 5 or 5th grade? Either way, it doesn't matter. He gets spit on by a kid in his class. He goes home crying to his mom, and she's like, "What do you want me to do about it? Sounds like your problem." And he's like, "Okay." So he goes to school the next day and he decks the kid. It's all right.
But that's a lot of the old tough love philosophy that our parents probably got from our grandparents, of like, what do you want me to do about it? You got to, you fight your own battles. That was a big thing when we were kids.
Paul Stanley, I mean, the way that he writes about it, it's like he's already isolated by, not having a right ear. And then he feels further isolated by having parents that just don't give a shit about what's
Mm.
going on in his life. And it's really sad. And I think it was something like you said that he battled those things until he really started to dig into, you know, himself. And we'll talk about that later.
Yeah.
But I'm going to say everything he endured at that age, everything that he went through, this guy is a survivor. And he doesn't seem to, I mean, and this, goes on into his teens when he starts working at the record store and all of that. But it seems like he doesn't wallow so much in it. It seems he just keeps putting one foot in front of the other, whatever that saying is. But he is a survivor. This guy, I mean, he's awesome. He wants to be good. He wants to be happy, I believe, in going on.
And he also he understood at a time when most people probably didn't, that there was some positive attributes to therapy, because he was going to see us. He went on his own. I mean, he wasn't forced by some counselor at school, or his parents didn't think it was a good. He sought it out on his own.
Absolutely.
And he went and did it. Okay, so let's move into his teenage years, and he starts to finally play the guitar, and he starts to learn about music and how being able to play guitar and sing is impressive enough that little teenage Stanley Eisen was able to get laid for the first time, and he starts realizing this is his calling. He would literally do anything to not have to go home.
Yes.
So if he could hang out with these record store people, or hang out with pretty much anyone, he would go over there to their house to spend more time with them, because he clearly did not like going home.
Yes. But in addition to that, he was having sex. I mean, from what it sounded like, 3 to 4 times a day. I mean, that's an exaggeration, but this dude, like, he came into his own,
Yeah,
I was really rooting for him at that part. I was like, hell yeah, dude. Like, you feel like you've been this monster, and now you're just like getting it right and left. You go.
I loved it. It was so funny. Wasn't there was a couple he was involved with that they had an open marriage, I thought. And
yes,
they did talk about that. Yeah. Were they the ones that owned the store, the
yes.
like head shop and the record store kind of thing?
I believe so. I think so. Yes. And listen, they all could have been totally high. The husbands could have not cared. I mean, everyone just could have been totally baked.
And they could probably be, these husbands they drive into the city. They're having sex with their secretaries. We've all seen Mad Men. Okay.
Yes.
We know how it is.
He definitely, what's the phrase? He glowed up, right?
Yeah.
He glowed up. Mm-hmm.
He definitely had that Riz back in the 60s.
For sure.
Another term from the modern era. Kiss gets going. They'd already had this band, Wicked Lester. They were signed to a major label. They made the album. They didn't like it. And Kiss, basically, Paul and Gene fired everybody and was going to reform the band. And a little known fact, and I don't remember if it was mentioned in the book, but when they auditioned and got the guys that became Kiss, they were auditioning them as the new lineup of Wicked Lester. That obviously was very misleading, because that Wicked Lester album never actually came out. And when it came out as a bootleg years later, it's dog shit. They were right. They should not have put that out. It was terrible. I mean,
their name's horrible. Wicked Lester.
Yeah, it's not very good, but that would be the least of the problems with that band. I mean, they were just whatever was hip in 1972, and they made that album. Oh, flutes are cool in rock. Let's put some flutes on that track. Oh, really? We need a sax. We need some harp. They just would put harp on. I mean, there was no stylistic continuity. It was just whatever was cool at that second. They just threw it on there, and they were especially very, very smart to have said, no, we don't want that to come out. And the second I don't think they mentioned this in the book either, but the second that Gene Simmons and Paul Stanley got some money, they bought that album back from Columbia Records so that they would never release it and show pictures of them, what they looked like without the makeup. In 1973, the lineup that we all know, Gene, Paul, Ace, Peter, 1973, They got going extremely fast because by February 74, their first album was out.
I will say, like, Gene Simmons just like grossed me out. He's messy. He's a slob. He doesn't take care of himself. And listen, we get I mean, I have a mother and I have a brother, so I get the aspects of that relationship, but that was nuts. But I just, like, he was so gross to me and so arrogant. And that's who he is, as we, David, all obviously.
Oh,
but yeah, he was just yucky. That's what I have to say about that.
Yeah. I mean, the two of them meeting was obviously a very significant thing, because Kiss would not have happened without those two, and it really wouldn't have happened without all four. I'm one of these people who believes that major bands, you're talking like the Beatles and the Who and the Kiss and whatever, if it's not those original three or four or whatever, it would not have worked. If one element was different, you wouldn't even know who they are. And I'm convinced of that. Even with the Beatles, with other bands, if there one person was different, we wouldn't even know who they are. And I still think that way with Kiss. So them meeting was perfect.
I think it's incredible that, and I think one of the themes of the book is that, Paul and, I don't know the other guys, well, not Peter.
Yeah. He really does not like Peter.
Paul's an incredibly hard worker. I mean, what I really appreciate about him is that he's like, I want to be a rock star. I'm gonna be a rock star. And he names it and he works toward it. And he's always got a plan that's going to get him farther. Recently, I was listening to somebody talking about, like manifesting things for yourself. And they made the point that it's not just like thinking about it in your head and hoping it'll happen. It's like thinking about the thing you want to happen and then figuring out the steps to get there. And that's 100% Paul Stanley.
Great.
And that's 100%, why he got to be a rock star, is because he just kept doing the work. He kept making a plan. If there was an obstacle, which there were many, he was like, all right, fine. What's next? What's my next step? Like, he never got defeated. And I just love that about him.
Yeah.
Another thing I wanted to say was, I also loved how he recognized that you have to act the part for people to believe it. And so even though they, had never played outside of New York, the intro was, you wanted the best, you got the best. Here's Kiss. And there's four people in the audience. And they're like, we're going to play like there's 1,000.
I loved that. I love it.
If I could go back in time to any period to see something musical, I would love to have seen Kiss in 1974 on that first tour, when they were playing at high school gyms and stuff like that, and nobody took them seriously and whatever, because I've heard tapes. People didn't have video cameras back then, but I've heard tapes. They were awesome live. But yeah, if I walked out or walked into a show and these guys walked out in 1974, I might have been like, what the fuck is with these guys? What is with this makeup and stuff? I guess that's a good transition with the makeup to talk about that there's actually greater significance to the makeup than just something as, I mean, it wasn't their gimmick or whatever it was. Yeah, Kiss wanted to be different. They weren't the first artist to ever do that. Alice Cooper, you had a little bit of makeup or whatever. The Arthur Brown from the Crazy World of Arthur Brown, he had makeup on. The New York Dolls were kind of feminine. They wore makeup. And they did take little bits from this and that. But what we realize now is that a lot of that makeup was like a real mask for Paul Stanley, because that way he could no longer be Stanley the one-eared monster, and he could be Paul Stanley, the fucking star child rock star. And yeah, like you said, he manifested it. He believed it. And if you act like it, then you become it. And he did. And that's why every single Kiss fan that read about this deformity in his ear was just like, wow, really? Like, no idea. Paul's just always been the epitome of a rock star. He's always acted that way. He's been, they all had their characters, right? So Ace was the space guy and Peter was the cat because he had a tough upbringing and he had the 9 lives, and Gene was the scary demon guy because he liked horror movies. And Paul wanted to be the star, and he was. And so it was very perfect. But it did really, really you to mask all of his insecurities and childhood traumas and everything. That he was a little bit more than just makeup and a little star on his face.
Yeah. And we learned that his hairstyle came out of wanting to cover up his ear as well.
Yeah. And it made sense because he had bushy, big hair, was always
Yeah.
covered, And then I remember in the early 80s, Kiss cut their hair in like 1981, like they were trying to get cool or whatever, hip for the time. But Paul, even though he'd had the first operation, now I know this, that he had his first operation, he used to wear a bandana and it would kind of cover up his right ear. So his hair was shorter, but he had this like bandana thing that would cover his ear. And I, of course, never thought of it. Why is he doing that? Never, just it's just his fashion, But now I know he did that on purpose. Like he still wasn't comfortable showing it. It wasn't fully done yet or whatever. It was a series of operations.
I have a question though.
Yes.
So was he as bad? Was Eric as bad and as needy and insecure as he was made out to be by Paul?
I mean, I don't know him on a personal level, but I did meet him a couple times and he was very nice.
So like, do you have any intel, like behind the scenes intel from your
I mean, I had heard that they weren't getting along by the late 80s, 88, 89. He wasn't getting along with Paul Stanley. I didn't know that they weren't speaking, like Paul said in the book that there was like months went by and they didn't even speak, which to me is just crazy.
It seems like, yes, from day one, Paul Stanley and Gene, it was their band. And Gene was kind of the big crazy thinker. Like when they were doing all the merch, remember when the merch just took off? And my brother had all of it, from the lunchbox to, the socks. I don't know. But, the thing about that is that Gene wanted to do something crazy and elaborate. And Paul's like, you can bring the sizzle, but they want the steak. We just made a like those lines are kind of funny from Shelley's boyfriend. But I feel like in a sense, when the two other guys came in after Ace and Peter left, right?
Yeah.
That's what it was. I'm just saying, like, these are the two original founding members. You're going to let these two guys that join you. Things were just so much more manufactured then too, as time went on.
Yeah. And look, and I don't care about their business arrangements or how they were paid or whatever. I know they were salaried employees and they worked for the band. They weren't partners in the band. And that's something that the other guys were partners in. But there was a sort of just like, I don't know. It's when it benefits Paul to have it be we, he says we. When it benefits Paul to be he did it, then it's I. And I know he's very critical of Gene Simmons in the book, of saying Gene does interviews and all he talks about is I, and he never says we. Well, Paul does the same thing. Okay. He does it all the time. And he's a little bit hypocritical in that regard. Only he can back it up because he was, running Kiss in the 80s. And although they weren't at the heights of their 70s fame when they were part of pop culture, they had a number of platinum albums. They had hits in the 80s, and those were all Paul Stanley songs. None of them were Gene Simmons songs. He was literally phoning it in. He was delivering garbage. Now, I didn't think that at the time. When I was 14 and 15, I loved those Gene songs. But now I'm realizing, that he was just, they were throwaways. He was barely there.
I was going to say that, I got the feeling, and I'm probably biased because I feel such affection for Paul Stanley now, but I really got the feeling that he, when Peter Criss and Ace Frehley left, he's like, those dudes could fuck this up. Like, any person can fuck up this band. And I have to take some ownership here to make sure that no one ruins this thing me and Gene worked hard to build. And it felt like he's like, I got to stand up and be the responsible person and keep this engine running.
Right.
Because there's so many things that could throw it off track.
Yes.
And he was the most responsible guy. Although I will say again, and he complained about this, the image was that Gene was the smart business guy, that Gene was the guy who came up with all the ideas. Yes. And now he's very keen on pointing out, no, it wasn't Gene. Okay. It was me. And that's another thing. So he let a lot of that slide in the 80s because I definitely believed it. I believed the hype about Gene Simmons, that he was the mastermind behind all the merchandising and all the marketing, and everything that they did was really secretly Gene. You now realize, no, it was not that way. And that Paul has been running the band since probably about 1984.
Mhm.
You know,
It's
like,
like Paul ran the band out of the gate,
yeah. Well, he was
really.
obviously the most responsible. But the one thing I think Paul doesn't give credit to the other guys enough for is a band is not just four individuals. There's a chemistry that happens when those four people do something together. And there's an undeniable chemistry. As much as Paul sees Ace Frehley and Peter Criss strictly as an obstacle for him, there was a chemistry that those guys had. And there's a reason why, even at their 50th anniversary show, their final show ever, 90% of what they played at the show was from those original days when those four guys created that music. They weren't doing all the stuff from the 80s and 90s and the 2000s because nobody cared, right?
Yep.
The core
Exactly.
of everything about Kiss was when those four guys were together. That's what bothers me sometimes about Paul, is that he dismisses the other guys' importance. Like, okay, yeah, you get annoyed that some guy gets drunk and he can't finish the part or whatever, or Peter's an asshole all the time and he threatens to quit. Okay, that's part of the drama of being in a band. And if that's what it took to make them so great, that all of that stuff from 74, 75, 76, when they were my favorite band and they were like the best in the world, like, I'll put that up against whatever they're doing now. Well, they're over now, but I mean,
I wouldn't have kept those two around as long as they did
Me neither.
because
No
they were
way.
total fuck ups and like
Yeah.
very just reckless and ungrateful for being millionaires because, Paul and Gene kept this band going and they're just like barely showing up, or at least Ace, who like you didn't know 10 minutes before the show if he was going to be there. So much so that the roadie, Tommy, has his own like outfit so that he can fill in. And
Right.
Ace
he
didn't
even
care.
gets called from a family vacation in Hawaii to come to a show to fill in for Ace. And then Ace shows up 10 minutes before the show. And here's the thing, I would have let Tommy do it. I would have been like, fuck off, Ace. Like, you had to be here earlier today in order to play this show. Like, if I were
Yeah.
Tommy, I would be pissed.
Yep.
And I really think that Tommy is the unsung hero of Kiss, frankly, because he really was the most reliable bandmate outside of Gene and Paul.
Yeah. Look,
Yes.
Tommy Thayer, I know him from he was in a band in the 80s called Black and Blue, and they used to open for Kiss, and I saw them back in the day. And he used to play Ace Frehley in a Kiss tribute band. So when he actually became the Ace Frehley character 10 years later and was up there doing it, it was just hard to believe. Like, it was hard to accept, frankly, and it was very difficult for me. I know we're jumping way ahead in the story, but I had a very difficult time with what they did. I get how difficult Ace and Peter are. I would have very impossible times dealing with them. I mean, I could not believe some of the crazy, stupid shit that they did, and their
Let's mention a couple of things
Yes,
for
please.
our
Sure, but
audience
let me
who
just
has
point out
not
one
read
thing.
this.
So I was at the opening night of their reunion tour in 1996 at Tiger Stadium. I was there. Okay. It was the closest thing I've ever experienced to having a religious experience. Like, it was amazing. And you cannot underestimate the extreme excitement and happiness of 45,000 people seeing Ace and Peter back with Kiss in the makeup, doing the show. It wouldn't have been the same if it was other people. And Paul likes to dismiss those guys and just say, well, it's just different guys in the makeup and now they're more reliable and this is what the fans want. I don't think that's necessarily true. You have to you have to tolerate a certain amount because creative people aren't normal and they don't act normally and they don't, you know. So Paul got to a point when once those guys were out of the band and he had guys who were just employees who did what they were told, that's when he had the epiphany. Hey, this is great. I don't get any back talk. I don't get anyone pushing back on me. Nobody shows up late. Nobody shows up, whatever. But were they as exciting? Were they as good? Were they as, interesting? No.
Can we talk about Donna Dixon? I mean, he dated Cher's sister for a while.
Mhm.
That seemed like it was kind of okay. And listen, I think, as far as I know, is that he was wanting a loving relationship. Like he was really realizing what.
Well, I think Donna Dixon seemed to be like in his mind, his first real relationship.
Absolutely.
I know he dated other women and stuff, but it seemed like, oh, who cares what happens to them? When they're gone, when I'm gone, don't ask me what I'm doing. I'm not going to ask you what you're doing. I felt like with Donna Dixon, he cared what she was doing.
Absolutely. A lot.
Yeah, a lot.
And a ton. And she just, I wonder what Dan Aykroyd thought of that. Like, oh, you're still talking to Gene Simmons? Like,
yeah,
or no,
Paul,
sorry,
right.
Paul Stanley.
Well, and then what happens when she leaves to go hang out with him for a couple of days? Is that what is Dan Aykroyd thinking? Is he just Lucy? Oh, well, whatever. I don't care what my new wife does. Are you fucking kidding me? Like,
well, to clarify for the audience, if you haven't read the book, so Paul and Donna have been dating for a couple years, and then they're kind of on and off, and he thinks they're going to get back together. And then I think he reads, on page 6
I think they had broken up, and then they started talking again, and he thought he's easing his way back into this relationship, and then he reads in a tabloid or something that she's been married to Dan Aykroyd for a few months.
Yeah,
they had worked together on a movie called Dr. Detroit, I think was the movie that they were in. And God, I remember Donna Dixon. Holy smokes. She was on Bosom Buddies with Tom Hanks back when Tom Hanks was still on TV.
That's when they started dating.
She was a major TV actress. She was beautiful, blonde woman. That's Paul's type, On the Donna Dixon front, when he did have that breakup, and it definitely affected him, he wrote a great song about it called A Million to One, which is on Kiss's Lick It Up album. And it is 100% about that relationship. And it is a genius song that Kiss never performed live. Or maybe it was too difficult for him. I don't know. But fantastic song. So we got something out of the relationship, Paul tried to avoid anything resembling an emotional attachment all throughout the 70s and 80s. And even when he says he was dating somebody, he really just said it was just about companionship and sex. And he didn't really want a deeper relationship because he was so messed up inside. And I think that's what it really was. He didn't want to open up to anybody because then they would see how fucked up he was. And that's what he was afraid.
And another thing, yes, David, and another thing, he put up with so much shit from these women, from Donna Dixon to his first wife, Pam. Was her name Pam? It was Pam.
Yeah, and calling her ex-boyfriend in Europe all the time, and
like refusing to not cut ties with him, even after he said it bothered him. And listen, I'm all for, my husband having female friends and what have you, or my boyfriend, whoever it was. But at the same time, there's a line that's crossed. It's almost disrespectful. It's beyond disrespectful, and it's insensitive. But like he's saying, I don't like what you're doing to me, Pam. You suck. And it turns out she did suck, but she wouldn't cut the ties. And she just kind of started wanting more and more, from bigger rings to better cars to, so much stuff. And he put up with it.
Oh, and then she blamed him for her career not happening, like she was like a B-level actress and she never really made it. And she blamed him for that. And it's like, I'm not saying Paul would be the easiest guy to get along with. We don't know what he's really like one-on-one, which maybe Shelley does, but I don't know what he's like that much one-on-one. But I would say he's definitely an odd bird, but he did put up with a lot. And the way he explains it is he wanted these relationships to work. He did not want to be the one that was responsible for it ending, because now he's all about, I'm Mr. Relationship. Like now, it used to be love him and leave him, but now I'm over that. Now I want to be married and I want a family and I want all those normal things that everybody else wanted before that I didn't see much value in, but now I do.
He has surgery and she's like, I ship the kid to my mom, and I'm going to go ahead and just stay in a hotel room the day after your surgery so that
Right.
I can practice for a role. Like, so I can practice for an audition. And it's
She
like,
didn't get. I bet
this
she was
poor
nervous.
guy is like in the dark in his house, like he can't do shit for himself. And his wife's like, you know what's more important? My audition.
Yeah, I got to
Like,
get that audition in, I got to practice my lines. I'm sorry. You'll be
Yeah,
sick in a week. It'll be okay.
she
talk
was
about
terrible.
narcissism.
So, Shelley, you need a minute?
I need a minute.
Okay.
Here's the thing. When we decided to read this book, I expected it to be a fucking disaster from a PC standpoint. You think Kiss, you think, Gene biting heads off of chickens. You think there's going to be all sorts of shit that just makes you cringe. And I'm not saying that there wasn't. There was stuff that made you cringe. I mean, the sheer number of people that Paul Stanley slept with is, hard for me to palate. But I will say he always said that he was honest with them if he was seeing other people, which I was surprised about. And really, the biggest surprise, and the reason I need a minute, is that of all the books we've read so far, this one, if I had to name the most PC book, it was this one. Like, first of all, Paul Stanley never drank, never did drugs. So refreshing to read the story of one of the most famous rock stars of all time and not
He
have to
smoked a
worry
little
about
pot
that.
as a teenager. He did mention he smoked a little pot as
He
a teenager.
did smoke a little weed, but come on, that doesn't really count.
Right.
Um, and I will say that, like, he clearly the therapy has paid off for him. He seems to have a high level of respect for people. At least in his older age, he is very open-minded, not judgmental. And truly, and I think this is why Jen and I were, I'm not going to speak for you, Jen, but one of the reasons I was crushing on him is just how developed he is as a human and how much he really did the work and realizes who his true self is and realizes the things that are truly important in life. And it's not, sleeping with penthouse models, and it's not fame, and it's not fortune. It's finding your true self and then finding someone else who knows their true self and building a life together. And so for me, it was shocking that that was sort of the outcome of this book. It was like, wow, I'm so glad I didn't put money on that because I would have been broke.
Yeah, I mean, and like we said at the beginning, the heart of it is the heart of Kiss is two nerdy Jewish guys
Yeah.
who really couldn't get girls when they were in their formative years, and that became their like mission in life. Story. I was a little surprised about the PC nature of Paul and the way he kind of came around as an adult. Not bad,
Jen, I want to hear why you were crushing and at what point, because for me, just listening to chapter 1, I was like, I'm in love with this guy. Because the chapter 1 really gives you sort of an overview of like where we're going to go in the book. And I was like, holy shit, this guy is so developed, so enlightened.
Agreed.
And
Agreed. Okay.
For clarification, I don't think he was enlightened when he was having sex with all of the groupies. It started, and this is so worth listening to anybody out there who has not listened to or read this book, was when he got invited to be in Phantom of the Opera as the Phantom, which I had no idea he did something like that. And to be able to do that is just nuts. I mean, I was so
Agreed.
impressed. But
Agreed.
that was what triggered his transformation as a human. And to like come to terms with the fact that he had this, I don't, or was lacking an ear, whatever, deformity.
physical
Yeah, that he
deformity.
had
Yeah,
a
physical
deformity.
Yeah.
And that like coming to terms with that could really help him so much and make him such a happier person. And that's when it was like, wow, he's on a path and it's really, really cool.
that was a major part of the story, is that Phantom of the Opera thing, because when he realizes that the reason why he's so affected by the story when he watched it the first time in the 80s, because remember he said he went with Samantha Fox, famous pop star from the 80s. He went with Samantha Fox to see the play, and while he was there in London or whatever, and he was so affected by it. So I think it was actually triggered maybe a little bit earlier. Like I don't know if he fully realized it until he started playing it or rehearsing for the role, but he definitely saw that connection at that time, because they did talk about how it affected him when he first saw it, and then later on to do that. But yeah, he is the Phantom of the Opera to a certain extent. He was hiding behind this mask, and he was worried about what people would think when the mask came off and they saw what he was like. Of course, it's when you know the public persona of Paul Stanley and you've known it for this whole time, he was considered the sex symbol in Kiss. The other guys in Kiss were ugly as fuck. It was always like Paul Stanley was the good looking one. Like every woman loved him and thought he was like the best looking guy in the band. And that was, I mean, in the 80s, he even said I kind of became an MTV like pretty boy for a little while,
Yes.
because he would go on MTV and host shows and do this kind of stuff. And he would go on by himself. It wasn't even go with Kiss. He went on by himself. So,
Jen, I still want to hear more about like why
Yeah,
you
so
were crushing on him.
let's hear a little bit.
So he's not really wallowing in a sorrow once he figured out how to get out of that. He was just so determined. He persevered. He was just, he was on a path, as we talked about in the beginning, to succeed. And he did, just to watch him keep climbing with everything that was stacked against him and how to work through everything. And I'm going to say this, my favorite part of the book, oh my God, this is what like solidified it before I passed him on. I'm just kidding. He said, when he first called Erin to ask her out, like they met, she was with Shannon Tweed's sister. And which at the beginning, I'm like, I don't know where this is going to go, but maybe it turned out okay. But when he called her and he asked her out and he's like, well, you want to come over for dinner? We can go out. If you come over, I can make some fish. I'm like, he's throwing the menu options at her.
Yeah.
Like that is so sweet. That is so kind. And he's just like basically saying, I want a partner. I want you to have a say in, what we're going to do, what you're going to eat. I don't know. I loved it. But I will say, the end of the book, I just to see him be able to forgive his parents, still be involved with them, to be able to, like, he's an amazing father, and they kept having more kids. And
so, yeah, I was impressed with all that stuff, knowing more about his life and everything, and that he did kind of want that, the full family life and everything. And he does seem like he's a generally decent person. I have issues with kind of how he ran Kiss to certain things. I don't like the Eric Carr situation. I don't like how when the original guys left again after 2000 and he put the other guys in makeup, and I thought it was disrespectful to them. And there are certain things about Kiss that still bug me to this day, but you know what, that's for another video, because the book is actually really, really great. It is a great book. The best of the Kiss books for sure.
Okay, I've got another thing to add about Paul Stanley that I loved. So remember when he bought the purple Mercedes, and he was like debating whether or not he should keep it. He was like, I don't know if he was test driving, and he goes, so I turned on the radio and Beth was on one end of the dial, and what was the other one? Not Detroit Rock City.
Rock and Roll All Night or something, maybe?
Yeah. Beth and Rock and Roll All Night. He's like, I'm good. I'm good. He was just, I don't know. I think he's just a good dude, and the way he talked about dealing with anti-Semitism, and we could be here all day talking about that, but just briefly, he was tuned in on it, like with every aspect of it. I mean, and we was trying to get apartments on Park Avenue. He's like, it's not that you're a rocker, it's that you're a Jew,
right?
Going in front of these co-op boards. And I don't know. He's just a strong, kind man.
I have one negative about the book.
Okay.
So he wears the makeup, right, to cover up who he is. And in the early days, he has all these women that want to sleep with him after the show. My question that he did not answer is, well, two questions. One, is the makeup still on when you're having sex? Or if it wasn't, how the hell did they know which one he was? Or was it just like, I know this is the band and I'll sleep with whoever wants me?
It might be something like that. It also might be Paul had the easiest makeup to see through. In other words, he had an all white face and he had one star. The other guys, their face was way more complicated. So maybe he was
True.
easier to pick out. But Gene Simmons does actually address that issue, and he said that some women asked him to keep it on, and
God,
he would.
I can see that.
So it was a kind of, you play it was situational, I suppose.
I just think it's hilarious thinking about having sex with one of those guys with their makeup on.
Yeah.
Well, listen, and all this stuff happened, like obviously way, way, way before phone cameras or any of that stuff. I just like, I don't know. These
They're
guys,
probably so glad.
I know.
yeah.
Okay, I have a question. So I remember watching, when were they inducted into the Rock Hall? 3 or 4 years ago, maybe?
Yeah, just maybe 5 years ago, or no, maybe
Yeah.
more like 10 years ago, actually. 2014, 2015, something like that. Yeah.
Oh,
They were
wow.
way overdue. They should have been in there a long time ago, but it was like 2014, 2015. Because it
Okay.
was after the book, because they didn't mention it in the book.
Interesting. Okay, I remember watching it. So who was up there? The four
The
original
four
members.
originals. So what the Hall of Fame said, that we're only going to induct the original four: Gene, Paul, Ace, Peter. And if you perform at the ceremony, it has to be those guys. And Paul Stanley said, no, that's not the lineup of the band. Like, those four guys can come up and accept the award because they're in the Hall of Fame. But if we're going to perform, it's going to be our current lineup. And when the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame said no, they said, fuck you, then we're not going to perform. And they didn't. They were all there and they got up and got the award, but it was only those four. And they apparently did lobby to get Bruce Kulick and Eric Carr and some of those other guys to be included. And the hall said no. Doesn't matter that, and this is not but Bruce Springsteen and the E Street Band are both in there separately. Like, what has the E Street Band ever done without Bruce Springsteen? That's just ridiculous. Why do they get a separate thing, but everyone in Kiss? Why is the Grateful Dead, every single member of that band gets to be inducted, but not every single member of Kiss? So it did seem to be selective, and he was pretty pissed about it.
Well,
Yeah.
I would have preferred they got up there with the original guys and just did it, but that's
so
not.
who covered it? Dave Grohl?
No, I think it was actually Tom Morello from Rage Against the Machine did their induction speech. So now let's go ahead and give our impressions of Paul Stanley after we read the book, and let's start with Shelley this time.
I mean, I think it's pretty clear. I like the guy. I think he's not at all what I expected him to be. I think he's incredibly smart. I think he's incredibly hardworking. I think that he's a highly developed human who is in touch with his thoughts and feelings and truly knows what to focus on in life. And all boyfriend jokes aside, I really do admire the way that he came off in this book, and who he became at the end, let's say.
Okay. Jen?
I loved this book. I thought it was great. I listened to it. I could not stop. It was so good. I kept texting both of you like intermittently. He's so great. I think it's amazing the person he's become. I think he out of the gate knew that that's who he wanted to be, and he got there. And he looks really happy.
Yeah.
I'm happy for him. And maybe the next time around, he will be attracted to a brunette with red lipstick.
Never know.
Well,
Could be.
Mean, his son might not be that far from my age. Is he seeing anybody?
His son is probably 30, maybe at this point.
That's a little too young.
A little young, maybe. I don't know. Still, it's worth a
Also, the
shot.
lipstick is my homage to Paul Stanley and
Right.
the Star Child.
I love
Well,
it.
my thoughts are still pretty similar. I mean, I was a fan the whole time going in. I did learn a tremendous amount, even though myself as a 40-year fan of the band who used to read every magazine article and read every, watch every interview, whatever. The fact that there was so much stuff in this book that I did not know, um, means it was genuinely a revealing book. Um, Again, I don't like I like there's a candor about working with the other guys, but I do think he was a little bit too negative and dismissive of the other guys in Kiss's role in the band. He focuses on the negative and not on all of the good stuff, because for every one incident of Ace being a drunken weirdo or whatever, there's probably 50 incidents of him being great on stage and the show being awesome and whatever. So I do think he tends to focus on the negatives. But look, it's his life and it's his perspective, and he certainly is entitled to it. I
And I
guess.
imagine talking about those things was a form of therapy for him. Maybe it's like, I just got to get this shit out.
Well, he made the point that they always in the early days would always leave the impression we're all for one for all, we're all a team, everybody contributes, everybody does this. And even though it stopped becoming that way after a while, they kept the facade. So now it does feel like Paul wants to clear the air. Oh yeah, it wasn't all four of us doing that. That was me, you know. And he does want to get a little bit of settling of the score of a certain degree, and just to make sure everyone understands he's in charge. But again, I think he understands the magic of those guys, and he does say at the talking about the Kiss at the beginning, how intense they were and how great, and it was it just, once they got famous, it just went all downhill, and it became Gene and Paul had to kind of run everything because those guys just could not handle it.
Because they were the stereotypical rock star
Yeah.
story of booze
And
and
just a second, when
drugs
they did the comeback, when they did the reunion, and then those guys became rich again and famous again and whatever, and they went down the exact same path, exactly the same. Now, I should note, Ace Frehley has been sober now for 12 years.
Wow, good job.
So, he did ultimately come around. I mean, it took him a long time, but he supposedly has been sober for 12 years. And that's good. He gets angry in the press because whenever Gene and Paul do interviews, they talk about how Ace was always wasted and this and that. And he's kind of like, look, I've been sober for over a decade. Like, you think you could stop with those stories all the time? He says, you're damaging my reputation by doing that, because it's
Not
harder
blame
for me
him.
to get work that way. And he has a point. Although, yeah, he was extremely difficult to deal with.
Good Lord, he was.
So,
Yeah.
anyways,
What a
those are my
ride.
final thoughts. I mean, I did learn a lot about somebody who I thought I knew almost everything about. And it is 100% worth reading this book, whether you're a
Yeah.
Kiss fan or not. It doesn't
Absolutely.
really matter. It's a good story. And he is a very, very interesting individual. And like you say, not at all what you would expect
Yeah.
based on the persona of Kiss.